What if the moment you thought was just another royal headline was actually the point of no return? Let that sit for a second, because what you're about to hear isn't about tabloid noise or social media outrage or recycled palace gossip. It's about a line being crossed, quietly, deliberately, and once that line was crossed, there was no walking back. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the unsettling question no one wants to ask out loud. What if Prince William didn't just distance himself from Prince Harry, but made a decision so final, so cold, that it effectively erased his brother from the future of the monarchy? Not yelled, not leaked in a rage, but handled with the kind of calm that only comes when someone has already made up their mind. And what if it's far worse than we were led to believe? Most people think they know this story. Two brothers. A feud. One stayed. One left. End of tale. But that version is comforting. Simple. Safe. The real version is messier. Darker. And far more consequential. Because this isn't just a family disagreement. It's about power, legacy, survival, and a choice that may haunt both men for the rest of their lives. Ask yourself this as we begin. If you were preparing to become king and your own brother kept threatening everything you were sworn to protect, how far would you go to stop the damage? That question sits at the heart of everything. For years, the public watched Prince William and Prince Harry as symbols of unity. Two boys walking behind their mother's coffin. Two young men standing shoulder to shoulder in uniform. Two brothers who, we were told, would always have each other's backs against a brutal press and an unforgiving institution. That image wasn't fake, but it wasn't complete. Because trauma doesn't just bond people. It also freezes them in different places. And when those people grow up under radically different expectations, the cracks don't appear all at once. They appear slowly, quietly, until one day, something snaps. Here's the part that often gets missed. William and Harry were never just brothers. From birth, they were assigned roles that guaranteed imbalance. One was raised to inherit a crown. The other was raised to support it. One trained to endure silence. The other allowed to rebel, until rebellion became his identity. And for a long time, that imbalance worked. Or at least, it appeared to. William learned control early. Emotional restraint wasn't encouraged, it was required. Feelings came second to duty. Appearances mattered more than explanations. When chaos erupted, he absorbed it. When pain struck, he swallowed it. That wasn't cruelty. It was conditioning. Harry, on the other hand, became the emotional lightning rod. The one who spoke when others stayed quiet. The one who acted out what everyone else repressed. He became the pressure valve for a family that never learned how to release pressure safely. At first, that dynamic bonded them. William protected. Harry provoked. Together, they survived. But survival isn't the same as healing. As they grew older, the world demanded different things from each of them. William's mistakes were managed. Harry's mistakes were magnified. William was praised for steadiness. Harry was tolerated for volatility. And over time, tolerance turned into judgment. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. What happens when one brother feels he is carrying the weight of an entire institution, while the other feels crushed by it? That tension doesn't explode overnight. It simmers. Enter adulthood. Enter marriage. Enter public scrutiny at a level neither man could control. When Catherine entered William's life, the system exhaled. She fit. She adapted. She endured. For the palace, that wasn't just love. It was relief. Stability had arrived. When Meghan entered Harry's life, the system stiffened. Not because she was wrong, but because she was different. She questioned things that had never been questioned out loud. She resisted traditions others had silently accepted. And most dangerously of all, she validated Harry's long-held belief that something was deeply broken. That's when the fault lines widened. From William's perspective, something fell off. The pace, the intensity. The collision between Harry's emotional rawness and an institution that survives by suppressing emotion. William had spent his entire life learning how not to rock the boat. Suddenly, his brother was flipping it over. From Harry's perspective, this was finally someone who saw him, who didn't tell him to endure, who didn't tell him to be quiet, who didn't tell him this was just how things are. Two brothers, two truths, both incompatible. And here's where things turned from tension into fracture. Leaving the royal system wasn't, on its own, the unforgivable act. People leave institutions all the time, even royal ones. What made this different was how public it became, how personal, how relentless. Interviews, documentaries, a memoir. Each revelation reframed the past. Each story pulled private wounds into the public square. And with every disclosure, something shifted inside William. This is crucial to understand. William wasn't just reacting as a brother. He was reacting as a future monarch watching the foundations crack beneath his feet. Every accusation wasn't just about family dysfunction. It was about legitimacy, trust, the moral authority of the crown. And William, unlike Harry, could not walk away from that responsibility. He was trapped inside it. So when people ask, why didn't William fight harder for reconciliation, they miss the deeper question. At what point does reconciliation itself become a risk? Imagine being told your entire life that one day, the stability of a nation will rest on your shoulders, that your personal feelings must always come second, that your family is not just your family, but a symbol. Now imagine that symbol being publicly dismantled piece by the person who knows its weaknesses best. At some point, emotion gives way to calculation. And this is where the story takes a chilling turn. Because sources, observers, and longtime royal watchers all point to a moment when William stopped responding as a wounded brother and started acting as a man drawing a boundary that could not be crossed again. No dramatic confrontation, no public denunciation, no explosive quotes splashed across front pages. Instead, something far more final. Distance. Silence. A recalibration of how Prince Harry was referenced, included, or quietly excluded. Invitations changed. Language shifted. Doors closed without announcement. In royal terms, that speaks louder than any declaration ever could. And then came what insiders describe not as an outburst, but as a decision. A hard one. The kind that doesn't leak immediately because it isn't designed for headlines. It's designed for permanence. This is where the phrase disown begins to hover. Not necessarily spoken, but understood. Disowning, in this context, doesn't mean erasing blood. It means severing relevance. It means removing someone from the future. It means accepting that no matter what history you shared, the path ahead will not include them. Think about how heavy that choice is. And then ask yourself another question. What kind of man does someone become after making it? This story matters now because William is no longer just preparing in theory. He is stepping closer to the throne in real time. Every move he makes is less hypothetical, more consequential. And the way he handles his brother is a preview of how he will handle dissent, instability, and threat when the crown is his. For Harry, the stakes are just as high, but in a different way. Identity, belonging, legacy. What happens when the institution you were born into no longer acknowledges you as part of its future? This isn't just about who is right or wrong. It's about what happens when love, duty, and survival collide, and only one can win. We began with a question about a line being crossed. Now here's the unsettling truth. That line wasn't crossed in public. It was crossed quietly, strategically, and once it was crossed, there was no applause, no closure, just a cold understanding that something essential had ended. But before we can understand exactly what that decision was and why it shook the palace to its core, you need to go back with me to where this all truly began. Because long before interviews, books, or headlines, there were two boys who promised each other they would never become enemies. And that promise didn't break all at once. It cracked. What if the story everyone thinks they know actually started breaking long before anyone noticed? Because the truth is, Prince William and Prince Harry didn't wake up one day as enemies. There was no single argument, no dramatic explosion at first. There was something far more dangerous than that. There was inevitability. Two brothers born minutes apart in childhood memory, but worlds apart in destiny. And from the moment they could understand language, those destinies were spoken into existence. Heir, spare. Say those words slowly. Feel the weight of them. One word carries expectation, power, and a future already written. The other carries implication, backup, insurance, replaceable. No one ever sits a child down and explains how much that will hurt later. They just let it happen. William was born with a crown hovering invisibly above his head. Every smile, every stumble, every success was measured against the future king he was expected to become. There was no room for improvisation, no space to fall apart. Even grief had rules. Harry, by contrast, was given something that looked like freedom. But it wasn't freedom. It was uncertainty. His role was never clearly defined beyond support, loyalty, and silence. And when a child doesn't know what they're for, they start asking dangerous questions. But before resentment, before rivalry, before the world intruded, there was love. Real love. Protective love. The kind that only siblings forged in trauma can understand. When Princess Diana died, the world watched two small boys walk behind her coffin. That image froze in time. But what the cameras didn't capture was what happened after the crowds went home. The nights. The silence. The confusion. The way grief settled differently in each of them. William internalized it. He became quieter, more watchful. He learned early that showing too much emotion invited scrutiny. So he shut the door and locked it. Harry externalized it. He acted out. He searched for attention, for reaction, for proof that someone still saw him. And when attention came in the form of criticism, it still counted as being seen. This dynamic became their rhythm. William steadied. Harry shook. Together, they balanced something fragile. For years, that balance held. In public, they laughed together. In private, they leaned on each other. William protected Harry from institutional consequences. Harry made William feel less alone inside a rigid system. They were two halves of a coping mechanism. But coping mechanisms don't last forever. As adolescence gave way to adulthood, the palace began tightening its grip on William. Training intensified. Expectations sharpened. He was no longer just a son or a brother. He was a future head of state. Every decision became strategic. Every friendship vetted. Every mistake minimized. And slowly, subtly, the space between the brothers grew. Harry noticed it first. Suddenly, William couldn't just drop everything. There were meetings, briefings, advisors, schedules that no longer revolved around family, but around the institution. The brother who once felt like a shield now felt like a wall. And here's the uncomfortable contradiction. William didn't choose distance because he stopped caring. He chose it because caring became dangerous. Inside the monarchy, intimacy is a liability. Vulnerability is a weakness. William learned that the hard way. The closer he got to the throne, the more he was warned. Protect the crown, even from yourself. Harry, meanwhile, drifted. Without a clear purpose, he defined himself by contrast. If William was restraint, Harry became expression. If William embodied duty, Harry embodied resistance. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was identity formation in a system that never offered him one. Ask yourself this. What happens when one brother is trained to suppress emotion and the other is punished for expressing it? Eventually, neither feels understood. The military gave Harry structure for a while, a sense of belonging that didn't come with royal choreography. He thrived there, but even that came with limits. He was still a prince, still watched, still managed. William watched his brother struggle and succeed, and something complicated stirred inside him. Pride, yes, but also fear. Fear that Harry was searching for something the royal world could never give him. Fear that one day, Harry would choose something else entirely. That fear wasn't unfounded. As they entered their 20s and 30s, the cracks widened. Different social circles, different values, different relationships. William gravitated toward stability and predictability. Harry toward intensity and connection. And then came the unspoken comparison. William's relationship unfolded slowly, cautiously. Years of waiting, years of scrutiny, years of proving that Catherine could survive the pressure. To the palace, this was ideal. Controlled, tested, safe. Harry's relationship arrived like a storm. Fast, emotional, all-consuming. It didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for approval. And most importantly, it didn't try to fit. From William's perspective, alarm bells rang. Not because he doubted his brother's capacity for love, but because he understood the cost of loving freely inside a system designed to punish it. From Harry's perspective, this was finally someone choosing him without condition. Someone who didn't see him as a role, but as a person. Do you see the collision forming? William believed survival meant adaptation. Harry believed survival meant escape. Neither was wrong, but they could not coexist. By this point, conversations between the brothers changed. Less joking, more tension. Advice began to sound like judgment. Concern began to sound like control. And control, to someone like Harry, was unbearable. William tried, in his way, to slow things down, to caution, to warn. But every warning felt to Harry like doubt. Every pause felt like rejection. And here's the tragedy. William wasn't trying to stop Harry from being happy. He was trying to stop him from being destroyed by a system William knew all too well. But good intentions don't soften bad delivery. What Harry heard was, "You're making a mistake." What William meant was, "This world will eat you alive." And once misunderstanding takes root, it grows fast. They stopped confiding in each other. Then they stopped trusting. Then they stopped assuming goodwill. And yet, publicly, they still smiled. That's the most haunting part of this chapter. The world saw unity while the foundation was already crumbling. They stood together at events. They spoke warmly of each other. They launched initiatives side by side. But beneath the surface, something fragile was failing. Think about it. How many relationships don't end in explosions, but in quiet emotional withdrawal? How many bonds die not from hatred, but from exhaustion? By the time the world sensed tension, the brothers were already living in different emotional universes. William felt burdened by responsibility Harry didn't share. Harry felt suffocated by expectations William had accepted. Each believed the other couldn't possibly understand. And once that belief sets in, communication becomes impossible. This is where the story truly shifts. Because from this moment on, every decision Harry makes will feel to William like a threat. And every boundary William sets will feel to Harry like betrayal. They were no longer just brothers reacting to each other. They were symbols pulling in opposite directions. And symbols don't compromise easily. So when people ask how it all fell apart so fast later, the answer is uncomfortable. It didn't. It fell apart slowly, invisibly, over years of silence, assumptions, and unspoken resentment. By the time the headlines exploded, the emotional war was already over. But the public battle hadn't even begun, because just as the brothers were drifting beyond repair, adulthood brought a force neither of them was prepared for. Love. And love, in this family, has a habit of detonating everything it touches. But what came next wasn't just about romance. It was about duty becoming a weapon. And that's where everything truly started to break. What if the very thing you were raised to honor slowly turned you into someone your own brother could no longer recognize? Because this is where duty stops being noble and starts becoming dangerous. By the time Prince William fully stepped into his role as the future king, the shift wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Meetings replaced moments. Briefings replaced conversations. Advisors replaced instincts. And somewhere in that transition, brotherhood became secondary. Not intentionally. Inevitably. William didn't wake up one morning and decide, "Today I will choose the crown over my brother." That's not how it happens. It happens in increments so small you barely notice them until you look back and realize how far you've drifted. For William, duty wasn't a choice. It was a gravity he was born into. The closer he moved toward the throne, the heavier that gravity became. Every word he spoke carried consequence. Every silence carried meaning. He learned that restraint wasn't just admirable. It was survival. Inside the palace, there is a saying few outsiders hear: emotion is a luxury. And luxuries are the first things sacrificed when stability is threatened. William absorbed that lesson deeply. Harry did not. From Harry's point of view, duty looked like a cage, a script he never auditioned for, a set of rules that changed depending on who you were and how useful you were to the system. He watched William adapt, comply, and harden. And to Harry, that adaptation looked like surrender. Ask yourself this. If you watch someone you loved slowly become less expressive, less available, less present, would you call it growth or loss? Harry called it loss. And that difference in interpretation is everything. As William's responsibilities increased, his margin for risk shrank. The monarchy doesn't reward spontaneity. It rewards predictability. And predictability requires control, not just over public image, but over personal relationships. This is where the brothers' paths truly diverged. William began seeing the world in terms of long-term stability. Decades, generations, optics. He thought in timelines that stretched beyond individual happiness. That doesn't make him cold. It makes him trained. Harry, meanwhile, lived in the present, in emotional truth, in immediacy. Pain that wasn't addressed felt like pain that didn't matter. And when pain doesn't matter, resentment grows. Their conversations started to feel transactional. William advising, Harry reacting, William cautioning, Harry bristling. What once felt like guidance began to feel like control. Here's the contradiction no one likes to admit. William's warnings were often accurate. The institution really was unforgiving. The press really was brutal. The system really did chew people up and spit them out. But accuracy doesn't equal compassion. Harry didn't want a risk assessment. He wanted understanding. And William, by this point, didn't have the freedom to offer it in the way Harry needed. Every time Harry pushed back publicly, William felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Because when one royal breaks ranks, the entire structure trembles. And William's job, whether he liked it or not, was to stop the trembling. So he did what the system taught him to do. He contained. He redirected. He minimized. And without realizing it, he began treating his brother not as an equal, but as a variable to be managed. That shift is subtle, but once it happens, the relationship is no longer symmetrical. Harry felt it instantly. He felt talked down to, managed, pacified, and for someone who had spent his life feeling secondary, that was unbearable. It confirmed his worst fear, that he was never truly seen as an individual, only as a supporting character in someone else's story. William, on the other hand, felt abandoned emotionally. He felt like he was carrying an invisible weight Harry refused to acknowledge. While Harry expressed his pain loudly, William swallowed his silently. And silence can feel like loneliness when no one notices the effort it takes. This is where resentment quietly switched sides. Harry resented William for becoming the institution. William resented Harry for refusing to understand it. And here's the tragedy. Both men were right. And both men were trapped. As public appearances continued, the contrast between them sharpened. William appeared measured, careful, increasingly formal. Harry appeared restless, candid, increasingly volatile. The press framed it as personality. The palace framed it as optics. But underneath, it was a philosophical divide. What is duty worth if it costs you your humanity? What is freedom worth if it destabilizes everything around you? Neither brother could answer the other's question. As William prepared more intensely for kingship, he began surrounding himself with people who reinforced caution. Advisors who had seen scandals destroy reigns. Strategists who spoke in terms of risk mitigation and narrative control. These voices didn't hate Harry, but they feared unpredictability. And Harry was unpredictable. Over time, those fears hardened into policy. Certain conversations were discouraged. Certain actions were frowned upon. Certain lines were not to be crossed. William internalized those boundaries until they felt like his own. Harry experienced those same boundaries as rejection. This is the moment where duty stopped being abstract and became personal. Because once William started thinking like a monarch in waiting, every personal conflict became a potential institutional problem. And Harry, whether he meant to or not, was increasingly perceived as one. Let that sink in. Imagine realizing that your own brother sees you not just as family, but as a risk factor. That realization changes everything. Harry pushed harder, spoke more openly, expressed frustration, not to harm, but to be heard. But in a system built on restraint, expression is interpreted as escalation. William responded by tightening the perimeter. Fewer candid exchanges, more intermediaries, more distance. What he saw as professionalism, Harry saw as emotional withdrawal. The brothers were now speaking different languages. And when people speak different languages long enough, even love sounds like hostility. This is why their eventual rupture felt sudden to the public, but inevitable to those watching closely. The emotional infrastructure had already collapsed. What remained was a facade. By the time love entered the picture in a way that challenged the system, William's patience was already worn thin. Not because he didn't care, but because caring had begun to feel incompatible with survival. And Harry, sensing that incompatibility, made a choice that would define everything that followed. He chose himself. That choice would be framed as selfish, reckless, disloyal. But to Harry, it felt like the first honest decision he'd ever made. To William, it felt like a betrayal of everything he was trying to hold together. And from that moment on, duty was no longer a shared value. It was a weapon. But the real explosion didn't come from policy or protocol. It came from the one force that exposes every weakness in a rigid system: love. And when love arrived, it didn't just challenge duty. It threatened to dismantle it entirely. But what happened next didn't just divide the brothers. It set them on a collision course that no amount of silence could prevent. Because the moment someone new stepped into Harry's life, every unspoken tension finally had a voice. And that voice would change everything. The moment Meghan Markle entered Harry's life, everything shifted. And not in subtle ways. It was seismic. For Harry, she was not just a partner. She was validation, a witness to his truth, someone who refused to bend to the unspoken rules he had spent his entire life trying to survive. She listened, she challenged, and, crucially, she protected him. For William, however, Meghan represented uncertainty. Not because she was incapable or unworthy, but because she was unpredictable. She disrupted the carefully maintained equilibrium of the family, introduced intensity where there had been control, and, perhaps most importantly, encouraged Harry to question the system William had dedicated himself to preserving. Suddenly, Harry was not only defying tradition, he was being encouraged to embrace it. William, trained to think in decades and generations, perceived Meghan's influence as destabilizing. And, from his perspective, he was right. The monarchy is a machine that runs on predictability, and unpredictability is its enemy. Every unapproved action, every unexpected public statement, every breach of protocol was magnified. And from William's vantage point, it wasn't just behavior. It was a threat to the legacy he had been preparing for since childhood. Meanwhile, Harry had never felt so seen. Here was someone who understood his frustrations, his pain, and his need to express it. The approval and understanding he received from Meghan contrasted sharply with William's more measured, restrained approach. This contrast deepened the rift that had been forming quietly for years. Where William saw responsibility, Harry saw repression. Where William saw stability, Harry saw confinement. This collision reached a breaking point when the world began paying attention. Interviews, documentaries, and public statements started painting the picture William had feared most. That the monarchy was oppressive, that it silenced those it claimed to protect, and that Harry was suffering under it. Every disclosure, every revelation, further destabilized the delicate balance William had spent decades maintaining. And with each one, William's patience thinned, replaced by calculation rather than emotion. The first major public blow came with the Oprah interview. From Harry and Meghan's perspective, it was a moment of liberation, a chance to finally tell their side of the story. From William's perspective, it was a violation, a betrayal that made private grievances painfully public. He was furious, not because the story was untrue, but because it exposed cracks in the institution he had been sworn to protect. Now, imagine this. You are William. Your brother, whom you love and feel responsible for, is exposing intimate family matters to the world, not in moments of private frustration, but in meticulously crafted interviews, designed to maximize public sympathy. Every word, every tone, every pause is amplified. And in your heart, you know that if this narrative persists, the future you have been building, carefully, silently, will be altered forever. This is the crucible in which William's mindset shifted. Not overnight, but incrementally. The brother he had grown up with, laughed with, mourned with, and protected had become a source of existential threat. The threat was not just personal, it was institutional. And in the monarchy, threats are managed decisively. Then came the memoir, the book that didn't just tell a story, it redefined it. With meticulous detail, Harry recounted experiences, accusations, and grievances that William had assumed would remain private. Even those closest to the brothers admitted the content was explosive. For William, it wasn't just hurtful, it was catastrophic. The narrative was no longer just about two brothers. It was about the stability of the monarchy itself. William's response was methodical. There was no public outburst, no fiery statement. Instead, he withdrew. Strategic silence became his tool. Invitations were carefully managed. Public appearances were recalibrated. Internal communications were filtered. This was not coldness for the sake of cruelty. It was coldness as armor. And here is the turning point. In royal terms, actions like these speak louder than words. By the time the world saw the headlines, William had already enacted what insiders describe as an emotional and relational severing. Not disowning in the literal sense, but disowning in every way that matters. Exclusion from succession planning conversations, carefully controlled access, subtle erasure from decision-making moments. Harry, naturally, responded with surprise and hurt. He had assumed his brother's bond was unbreakable, but what he experienced was clarity, an unspoken boundary that could not be crossed. William had drawn a line, and crossing it was no longer possible. This was no longer sibling rivalry. This was strategic finality. William had stepped into the role of protector, not of Harry, but of the institution that would one day demand everything from him. Every act, every statement, every public appearance would now be judged not only for its emotional authenticity, but for its impact on legacy. And in that context, Harry was no longer a brother to negotiate with. He was a variable to manage. So what did Harry do next? He chose exposure over reconciliation, expression over restraint, public truth over private counsel. And William, who had been trained to endure personal betrayal silently, understood what had to come next. This is where the story becomes darker than anyone expected, because the choice William faced was not about forgiveness. It was about survival. Not just survival for himself, but survival for the monarchy, the legacy, and the future he would inherit. And in that moment, he made a decision that would resonate for years, quietly, irrevocably, and without fanfare. And yet, the world has only seen fragments of it. Interviews, leaked statements, and social media speculation tell part of the story, but the truth, the calculated, deliberate choices that define a family's future, remains hidden behind palace walls. Ask yourself, what would you do if your responsibility was larger than your love? If protecting a legacy meant hurting the person you care about most? If silence could save everything, but speaking could destroy it all? This is where the royal family stands today. Two brothers, divided not by hatred alone, but by duty, by love, and by choices that neither can reverse. But what comes next isn't speculation. It isn't rumor. The next chapter is the moment when William drew a line so clear, so final, that the word disown became less a statement and more a reality. And that moment would change the course of their relationship forever. By the time that line was drawn, William had already stopped seeing Harry as just a brother. In his mind, Harry had become something else, a variable, a liability, a living reminder that even love could threaten the stability of an institution centuries in the making. And in that context, William's actions weren't cruel. They were calculated, deliberate, and final. It wasn't a shouting match in a hallway or a slammed door in a palace corridor. It was subtle, invisible to most observers. But in royal terms, subtlety can be far more punishing than public confrontation. Invitations weren't extended. References were carefully worded. Privileges and access that were once assumed were quietly rescinded. Every interaction became a measurement of loyalty, caution, and compliance. For William, this wasn't personal revenge. It was preservation. Every step he took was about shielding the monarchy from exposure, scandal, and instability. His role demanded foresight, patience, and a willingness to bear personal pain for the greater good. And no one could have understood that better than William. He had been groomed for it his entire life. For Harry, the effect was devastating. Every closed door, every measured response, every omission felt like rejection. It wasn't just that his brother wasn't supporting him. It was that he had been quietly erased from the decision-making, from the planning, and from the narrative itself. And in a family where perception is reality, erasure can feel like death. The heartbreak is that neither brother wanted it to come to this. Their childhood memories, their shared grief, their early loyalty, all of it mattered. But in adulthood, love alone was no longer sufficient to bridge the chasm. Their values, perspectives, and priorities had diverged too far. Where Harry prioritized honesty, emotional truth, and personal freedom, William prioritized duty, legacy, and protection of the crown. That divergence created a paradox. Harry's attempts at connection were interpreted as defiance. William's attempts at control were interpreted as betrayal. And the cycle only fed itself. Each misunderstood act compounded the previous one, until reconciliation seemed impossible, even when both brothers longed for it in private moments. The tipping point, insiders say, came after Harry's public disclosures in interviews and books. What may have seemed like personal grievances were, to William, evidence that Harry could no longer be trusted to respect the boundaries necessary to safeguard the monarchy. And once trust is lost in this context, the consequences are severe and often irreversible. At this stage, William's decisions became permanent. They were not made in anger, but in clarity. He could not risk appearances, protocol, or legacy. Every choice was a protective measure for the institution he would one day lead. And protecting the institution meant that Harry, beloved brother or not, could no longer occupy the same space within it. Yet, there is nuance here. William didn't demonize Harry publicly. He didn't issue proclamations. In fact, many of his actions were invisible to the world, known only to palace insiders. That quiet severing is far more powerful and far more final than any public declaration because it communicates what words cannot: exclusion, erasure. The reality that, despite blood ties, some paths cannot converge. Harry's response was inevitably mixed. Shock, hurt, and defiance emerged alongside a measure of understanding. He recognized that William's behavior wasn't about personal dislike, it was about responsibility. But understanding doesn't heal the wound of exclusion. It doesn't erase the sense of being disowned, even when no single word is spoken. From the outside, this may seem dramatic or extreme. But within the context of the monarchy, this is the language of survival. It's how families navigate centuries of legacy while under relentless scrutiny. It's how personal emotion is often subordinated to institutional need. And it's a stark reminder of how deeply personal conflict can intersect with public duty. Now, imagine being trapped in that position. Every public move is scrutinized, every private action is judged, and every decision has ramifications far beyond personal life. For William, every misstep by Harry was not just a sibling issue. It was a potential crisis for the future of the crown. And once the perspective shifts from sibling to steward, reconciliation becomes nearly impossible. What you feel for a brother conflicts with what you must do as a guardian of history, culture, and legacy. And in William's case, the guardian role outweighed the brotherly role. That is why insiders describe the period following Meghan's entry and Harry's public disclosures as a point of no return. William's restraint, strategic silences, and careful management weren't signs of indifference. They were measures of finality. They created a reality where Harry's influence, while undeniable, was no longer integrated into the family structure that would soon bear the full weight of kingship. But here is the hardest truth. While William may have acted with the crown's survival in mind, the cost was personal devastation. Two brothers, raised under the same roof, bonded by trauma, and once inseparable, now stood apart in ways that words could never reconcile. And the world was just beginning to notice. Because the next step in this story wasn't just about private pain, it was about public reckoning. The moment had arrived when William's decision, already made in principle, would have to be reflected in the world outside the palace walls. Invitations would be denied, appearances adjusted, and language carefully chosen to reflect reality without a single public confrontation. And in that moment, the phrase, "we disown you," became less a rumor and more a reflection of fact. Not spoken aloud, but enacted. And the impact would reverberate far beyond family disputes. Touching the monarchy, the media, and millions who watched in fascination and disbelief. But the story doesn't end here. Because as William's actions solidified, Harry was already preparing his next move. One that would shock the public, challenge the monarchy, and push their fractured relationship into entirely new territory. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The public would never fully see the depth of what had been decided behind palace walls. Every royal event, every interview, every carefully crafted photograph was a signal, a quiet assertion that the rift was real and enduring. William's decisions weren't about vengeance. They were about creating a reality where Harry's influence on the monarchy, and by extension, the future of the institution, was limited, controlled, and ultimately minimized. At this point, the feud had moved beyond personal hurt. It had become structural. Invitations were no longer automatic. Privileges previously taken for granted were reassessed. Even language within the family shifted. In correspondence, in official statements, and in internal discussions, Harry was increasingly referred to in terms of external member rather than active participant. Each word was deliberate, each omission intentional. For Harry, the effect was devastating. Imagine realizing that your role in the family you were born into is not only changing, but being quietly redefined in ways that fundamentally exclude you. It's one thing to feel alienated. It's another to have the boundaries drawn so carefully, so permanently, that exclusion becomes fact rather than perception. The mental and emotional toll was enormous. Harry felt increasingly isolated, despite the constant public attention and media presence. Support came from outside the institution, but the pain inside the palace was private, silent, and unrelenting. He struggled with a deepening sense of betrayal, even as he tried to reconcile his love for his brother with the reality of their separation. Meanwhile, William's perspective was starkly different. From his vantage point, every precaution, every subtle exclusion, was an act of preservation. The monarchy is not an abstraction. It is a living institution that depends on control, consistency, and perception. If the future king could not maintain boundaries, even with his own brother, the entire structure could be compromised. The critical moment came when advisors began framing the situation in stark terms. It is not personal, they reminded William. It is institutional survival. And William, having spent his entire life internalizing the weight of legacy, understood precisely what that meant. Love alone could not protect the institution, nor could appeals to sentiment. Action had to be decisive. This is where we start to see the emergence of what insiders refer to as the disowning effect. It was not literal in the sense of cutting all ties or declaring enmity publicly. Instead, it was procedural, emotional, and symbolic. Harry would no longer have the same level of influence, access, or participation as before. Where once he might have been consulted, included, or even deferred to in family matters, now he was peripheral. His presence mattered less, not because he had done nothing of value, but because his choices had created risk. And this, as insiders repeatedly stress, is what makes it worse than anyone expected. Many assumed that this feud was about ego or publicity. In reality, it was about survival, responsibility, and the inexorable logic of monarchy. William's actions were precise, measured, and almost surgical in their execution. And for Harry, there was no playbook to respond effectively. The rules had changed beneath his feet. Now, consider the human dimension. Two brothers, raised in the same environment, bonded by grief and childhood intimacy, now operate under entirely different paradigms. One prioritizes legacy above all else. The other prioritizes autonomy, truth, and emotional authenticity. Both are justified in their perspectives. Both are constrained by forces far larger than themselves. And the result is a dynamic in which personal affection is secondary to survival. Even attempts at reconciliation were carefully filtered through these new realities. Where once private talks might have resolved tensions, they now risked exposure or misinterpretation. Any overtures required extreme caution. And so, silence prevailed. Not because the brothers didn't care, but because acting without precision could worsen the situation irreversibly. This silence is critical to understanding the depth of the rupture. The world saw glimpses of tension, but the true magnitude remained invisible. Those glimpses, when pieced together, hint at a relationship that has transformed from familial intimacy into strategic distance. And in this context, disowning is less about animosity and more about management. A deliberate, calculated decision to limit influence while protecting legacy. Harry, naturally, was forced to adapt. He sought alternative channels for his voice, increasingly turning to media, memoirs, and public appearances. These acts were not just personal expression. They were responses to exclusion, attempts to assert relevance and agency in a system that had quietly sidelined him. William, meanwhile, continued to operate with the crown's long-term interests in mind. Each public engagement, each ceremonial duty, each controlled statement reinforced the boundaries he had established. His restraint was not indifference, it was strategy. Every move was measured against decades of precedent, perception, and institutional risk. What makes this so compelling and so tragic is that both men acted in alignment with their values. Harry acted from authenticity, transparency, and personal truth. William acted from duty, foresight, and preservation. Yet their values collided, creating a chasm that neither could bridge, no matter how much affection or shared history existed. By now, the dynamic had fully shifted. William's decisions had established a new reality. Harry was a peripheral figure within the family structure that mattered most to the crown. Public statements could no longer reverse this reality. Private negotiations were constrained by institutional necessity, and every subsequent action had to operate within this framework. The tension between them was no longer just emotional. It had become structural. Each man's choices reinforced the other's position, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of distance. William's strategic withdrawal necessitated Harry's search for alternative channels. Harry's public disclosures necessitated further boundaries from William. And so the rift widened, quietly but inexorably, under the gaze of a world that could only guess at its depth. And then came the turning point that would define the next era of their relationship. A moment where private calculation intersected with public reality, making it impossible for either brother to return to the dynamic they once shared. A moment when the consequences of years of subtle tension, emotional divergence, and strategic thinking became undeniable and irreversible. But what came next would escalate the situation beyond anything the public could have anticipated, and set the stage for a reckoning that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the palace. The moment that turning point arrived, it wasn't with fanfare. There was no public confrontation, no scandalous headline in the first instant. It was quiet, calculated. Insiders describe it as almost imperceptible, yet its effects were seismic. The line William had drawn, a line that had been forming over years of tension, disappointment, and protective calculation, was now formalized. Not in words, but in actions. Harry's presence within the family's operational sphere was systematically reduced. Invitations to key family events were selectively withheld. Decisions that once might have included him now bypassed him entirely. Public appearances, engagements, and charitable initiatives were managed in ways that minimized overlap. Language, previously casual and fraternal, became precise, measured, and distant. Every move reinforced a reality that was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. Harry's role within the monarchy was no longer equivalent to William's expectations or needs. For William, the calculus was clear. The monarchy is not a family business. It is an institution designed to endure centuries, to survive beyond the lifespan of any individual, to protect traditions, values, and the continuity of leadership. Every unpredictable action, every public disclosure, every deviation from protocol by a member of the family could threaten that continuity. Harry's choices, magnified by the public eye and amplified through media channels, posed a direct challenge to this fragile equilibrium. And so, William's response, though measured, was decisive. He did not confront or argue. He did not seek dramatic gestures of reconciliation. Instead, he enacted exclusion with precision, reinforcing boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence. Every decision was strategic. The less Harry had access to key decisions or platforms, the lower the risk to the institution's stability. This wasn't personal vendetta. It was systemic management. But for Harry, the reality was devastating. To be disowned in such a nuanced, quiet way is to feel invisible in a system that has defined one's identity since birth. Blood alone no longer determined one's influence. Privilege, access, and presence were now contingent on compliance, alignment, and predictability. And when a brother you love becomes the enforcer of these limits, the emotional impact is profound. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Harry, raised to resist, to speak, and to assert himself, was now faced with barriers he could not easily overcome. Every attempt at communication was filtered, every overture measured, every action interpreted through the lens of institutional survival. His world had shifted from one of familial support to one of strategic navigation, where missteps could carry consequences far beyond personal relationships. From William's perspective, every step he took was necessary. Each exclusion, each recalibration of roles, each careful distancing was a protective measure. The monarchy, after all, demands foresight. It demands sacrifice. and it demands that personal loyalty sometimes be subordinated to the greater good. William had internalized this lesson from childhood. In his mind, failure to act decisively would risk more than hurt feelings. It could destabilize an entire institution. Yet, the human cost of these actions was staggering. Two brothers, once inseparable, now navigated the delicate balance between familial love and institutional responsibility. Each step William took to protect the crown widened the emotional gap with Harry. Each act by Harry to assert independence widened the practical gap with William. The cycle reinforced itself. Distance begets distance, withdrawal begets withdrawal, and the chasm grows without overt confrontation. Public perception, as always, lagged behind reality. Media coverage focused on interviews, memoirs, and selective statements. Social media amplified every word, every gesture, every misstep. But the true story, the strategic decisions, the carefully managed boundaries, the quiet exclusion, remained largely invisible. And this invisibility only intensified the sense of betrayal for Harry, who now had to operate within a world that simultaneously acknowledged his presence and limited his influence. The defining moment came when advisors confirmed that William's measures were effectively irreversible. In the language of the monarchy, boundaries had been drawn so clearly that even private appeals could not undo them. These were not temporary adjustments. They were structural changes in the relationship. Exclusion became fact, distance became reality, and the influence of the younger brother was contained. Harry's response was both predictable and profound. He sought alternative platforms to express himself: interviews, public appearances, media engagements. These actions were attempts not just to assert autonomy, but to reclaim relevance in a system that had systematically sidelined him. Each move, however, reinforced William's original calculation. Unpredictability and public disclosure could not be ignored or accommodated without risking the institution's stability. At this stage, the rift had become a structural reality. It was no longer just an emotional fracture. It was an operational divide. William acted as the steward of tradition and legacy, managing risk and perception. Harry acted as the agent of personal truth, expression, and autonomy. Both were right within their own frameworks, yet both were trapped by forces beyond their personal control. And now, the situation was reaching its most critical juncture. Because in this environment, the next steps would not be measured in private gestures, negotiations, or apologies. They would be defined by public perception, media scrutiny, and strategic positioning. Every move Harry made would be interpreted as defiance. Every move William made would be interpreted as enforcement. And the consequences would extend far beyond personal hurt. They would influence the monarchy, public opinion, and the narrative of two brothers in history. But the most shocking development was yet to come. Because in this carefully controlled reality, Harry was preparing an action that would not just challenge William's decisions, it would challenge the monarchy itself. And the ripple effect of that move would make the previous years of tension look like a prelude to something far larger, far more consequential, and far more dramatic than anyone imagined. What came next would finally force both brothers, and the world, to confront the truth. Some lines, once drawn, cannot be crossed without reshaping everything that came before. The moment Harry decided to go public in a more dramatic way, everything escalated. This was no longer whispers behind palace walls or careful omissions in invitations. This was a deliberate, calculated exposure that challenged not just William personally, but the entire system he had been trained to protect. Harry's next moves weren't impulsive. They were strategic, aimed at reclaiming agency in a world that had quietly limited him. For William, it was a nightmare scenario. Every private boundary he had painstakingly set was now threatened by visibility. Public opinion became a weapon, capable of undermining decades of careful preparation. Every statement, every interview, every media appearance by Harry now carried potential consequences that extended far beyond the personal. They reached into the heart of the monarchy, questioning authority, stability, and legacy. It's essential to understand how this escalation affected both brothers psychologically. William, whose life had been conditioned by duty, control, and foresight, now faced the stress of public exposure of family dynamics he had sought to manage silently. Every day brought a new headline, a new narrative, a new twist on private matters he had intended to remain contained. The tension wasn't just emotional, it was existential. How could he protect the institution he was destined to lead when one of its most visible members openly challenged it? Harry, meanwhile, operated from a different set of imperatives. He sought transparency, authenticity, and recognition. The quiet exclusion he experienced behind the scenes had made him increasingly public in his methods. Interviews, statements, memoirs. All were tools to assert identity and control in a system where he felt sidelined. From his perspective, he was not defiant for the sake of defiance. He was reclaiming the narrative that had been quietly denied him. The collision of these worlds, the private, procedural world William inhabited and the public, expressive world Harry now occupied, created unprecedented tension. The monarchy had survived decades of scandals, but this was different. This was a direct challenge from within, a friction point that tested not just familial bonds, but the very mechanics of succession, legitimacy, and public perception. Insiders reveal that the palace moved quickly to mitigate damage. Advisors, strategists, and communications teams began carefully orchestrating responses, controlling appearances, and recalibrating public messaging. William's approach remained methodical: contain, manage, and preserve. Every engagement was scrutinized, every word weighed. And in the background, the structural boundaries between the brothers became increasingly rigid. But Harry's actions complicated the equation. Every public revelation, while emotionally motivated, forced William to respond, not with anger, but with calculated measures that reinforced exclusion. Invitations were adjusted. Engagements were structured to minimize overlap. Public appearances were choreographed to present unity superficially while maintaining private distance. Every step was a reinforcement of the line William had drawn, a line that now had to exist both in private and in public reality. The psychological impact on Harry was profound. To be sidelined quietly is one thing. To be sidelined while simultaneously exposed publicly is another entirely. He faced scrutiny not just as a royal, but as a family member who had been marginalized. The stress, frustration, and sense of betrayal compounded, driving him further toward public avenues of expression. And with each act, William's fears of instability appeared increasingly justified. Yet, there is a paradox at the heart of this conflict. William's measures were designed to protect, not punish. Harry's actions were designed to assert, not harm. Both were motivated by deep-seated values: duty and legacy for William, autonomy and authenticity for Harry. And yet, the intersection of these values created an unavoidable collision course. Neither side could compromise without feeling that the very core of their identity or responsibility was at risk. The situation now demanded a delicate balancing act. For William, every move had to preserve the monarchy's reputation without inflaming further tension. For Harry, every move had to assert visibility and truth without causing irreparable damage to family relationships. Both were navigating a minefield where the wrong step could have lasting consequences, personally, publicly, and historically. And then came the tipping point: a revelation, a memoir passage, or a public statement that would define the next era of their conflict. This was the moment when private exclusion collided with public exposure, making the silent boundaries William had drawn impossible to maintain unchallenged. For the first time, the decisions made quietly behind palace walls would have to be defended, explained, or confronted in the public eye. This was not just a family dispute anymore. It was a turning point that would redefine their relationship forever, showing the world the stark reality of what happens when love, duty, and legacy collide. And in the aftermath, both brothers would be forced to reckon with one truth. Some divisions, once institutionalized and reinforced by strategy and circumstance, cannot be easily mended. What followed next was unprecedented in the modern history of the royal family. The quiet, strategic severing of Harry's role became impossible to contain as the public caught wind of cracks that had been forming for years. Every interview, every leaked story, every calculated memoir excerpt added pressure. For William, it was the ultimate test of control. how to maintain the integrity of the monarchy while the fracture in his own family widened in plain sight. Insiders describe the period as one of high tension, quiet maneuvering, and careful orchestration. William's strategy was clear: reinforce boundaries without causing a public spectacle. He could not openly disown his brother. That would provoke scandal and criticism. Instead, he relied on subtlety, curating appearances, filtering invitations, and guiding media narratives. Every act was a reminder of the new reality. Harry's influence within the family and the monarchy had limits that could not be crossed. For Harry, the public nature of his disclosures became both a weapon and a shield. Interviews were not just personal catharsis. They were strategic acts of assertion. Every statement highlighted his grievances, exposed the pressures he faced, and challenged the constraints imposed by his brother's decisions. Through media and memoir, Harry was reclaiming autonomy, refusing to be sidelined silently. The clash of perspectives could not be more stark. William saw unpredictability and public exposure as threats to an institution he had been groomed to protect. Harry saw restraint and exclusion as betrayals of familial loyalty and personal truth. Both believed they were acting from principle, and both were right. But principle and alignment had diverged so sharply that reconciliation seemed impossible. This period also revealed how different their communication styles had become. Private discussions, which might once have resolved tension, were now filtered through intermediaries, advisors, and PR channels. Direct conversation was rare, fraught with risk, and often counterproductive. Even when attempts were made, they were misinterpreted or filtered through decades of accumulated frustration and misunderstanding. Silence, rather than speech, became the default mode. The psychological weight on both men was enormous. William carried the burden of legacy, duty, and the expectations of an entire institution. Every decision had to be considered in terms of long-term stability, public perception, and historical precedent. Harry carried the weight of exclusion, frustration, and the need to assert identity. Every public statement, every book passage, every interview was a balancing act between personal expression and the consequences it might trigger.